To talk this question of civility and its presence in American history, we're going to speak with Nicole Hemmer, author of Messengers of the Right, Conservative Media and the Transformation of American Politics, an assistant professor at the University of Virginia's Miller Center of Public Affairs, and co-host of the Past Present podcast. Hi, Nicole. Welcome to Trumpcast.
Hey, Jamel.
So this week, listeners already know that we've had this conversation over the last week about civility in politics and where it's gone and where it's going, and so forth. And you wrote a really interesting piece for Vox this week where you're a columnist, pushing back against historical comparisons, or at least ones that sort of argue that we were more civil in the past. So could you speak a little bit about those comparisons and what you find wrong about them?
Right. So one of the big comparisons that was being made was about Martin Luther King, that King would have embraced civility over disorder, incivility, or being mean to people. And in many ways, I saw kind of the recreation of the same arguments that were being used against King back in the 1950s and 1960s, that civility was being used as kind of a cudgel to shut people up and to stop the argument rather than to kind of further it. And what I mean by that is that back when King was pioneering his methods of direct action, when he was engaging in civil disobedience, he wasn't considered civil at all in that time. In fact, he was constantly being called upon to be more civil, to stop disrupting things, to just wait for the law to work or for arguments to work, and not to keep instigating these moments of riots or violence or mayhem, to stop being an agitator. King himself, even though he did believe very strongly in nonviolence, not just as a tactic, but as a way of life, he believed you should be civil, that you should be nonviolent, not only in your actions, but in your words, was in many ways aware of the ways that civility was used to shut protests down and to prevent justice rather than to further it.
So I think it might be worth stepping back from here a little bit and trying to parse what exactly we mean these days when we talk about civility, because the precipitating incidents for this conversation were the sort of public shaming of several Trump administration officials, and then at the restaurateur in Lexington, Virginia, who asked Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders to leave her restaurant, and that then prompted a whole conversation about whether that's appropriate, whether it's uncivil to use those actions. But it's unclear to me what people mean by civil, right? Like, is it simply being calm? Is it simply being sort of polite? Or is there some other argument about sort of the role of politics and civil society that's going on?
So I think that this is actually a big part of the problem. And this is why the Red Hen case being the center of this conversation is so confusing. Because if you look at the actions of the owner and the people at the Red Hen, they were incredibly civil in just about any way you could define the word, right? They very calmly call Sarah Sanders aside. They explain to her very calmly what their reasoning is for not being able to serve her. They comp her meal, and then they don't say anything about it, right? They don't run to the press and say, look at what we did to Sarah Huckabee Sanders. And so that makes this a particularly odd case for it. But at the same time, I think it helps us understand the way that civility can be used as a kind of wily weapon against any sort of activism or speaking out, right? I mean, what happened here? You had people talking to a public official and expressing their discontent in probably the most civil way possible, and yet still being beaten back by this idea that they're not being civil enough, and being beaten back across the political spectrum, right? It's not just conservatives who are coming out against the Red Hen. It's Bernie Sanders, it's Nancy Pelosi. So it's really happening across the board.
I guess the thing that I find baffling about all of this is that in addition to sort of the paradigmatic examples of protest in the 60s and 70s being decidedly uncivil by this common meaning, what it seems like is happening is essentially an argument that there is no place in politics, in public discussion for what I guess we'd call public shaming or like moral opprobrium, or casting some political actions as beyond, ordinary politics in the sense that we can all disagree or agree about tax policy, and towards sort of something more akin to an ethical problem that must be confronted. That like the argument, the implicit argument at least from the critics of the Red Hen and others is that that has no place in politics as we understand it. And that just seems really like ahistorical to me. It seems not of a piece with how Americans have done politics since the country's inception.
Right. There's no place really for righteous anger. And I think you make a good point about bringing this to kind of a moral discussion and the lines that are being drawn here. I mean, we've seen throughout American history people using different types of violent, nonviolent, civil, uncivil actions, especially when the political system fails them, right? So if we think about anything from John Brown and abolitionists who are fighting back against the system in which there is no room within the political realm to really debate or to have a discussion or to end something as immoral as enslavement. If we look at women fighting for suffrage and having to use all kinds of tactics in order to disrupt the normal politics in order to get their agenda on the table. Or as you rightly point out, in the 1960s and 1970s, the work of activists to, again, break through this kind of consensus that civility was protecting. And I think that's what's so important about understanding this nostalgia about civility is that yes, I think, mainstream politics in the 1950s and early 1960s looked incredibly civil. And in fact, if you look back at the newspaper records of the time, there's this real lacuna, this real dip in any discussion about civility in the 1950s and early 60s. But part of that was that so much of politics was taken off the table. And this sort of general white middle class consensus was being held up by both parties, by the journalists of the day, and anything outside of that consensus was deemed both illegitimate but also uncivil. And there wasn't really a space in mainstream politics to make your case. So something like a lunch counter sit-in, something like a March on Washington in 1963 is seen as rabble-rousing and uncivil and outside of the bounds of normal politics. And I think that's what we're kind of seeing today as the politics of the day get more and more out of bounds, and as there's fewer and fewer options for people to protest within the mainstream political system, you're going to get these confrontations, in part because the acts of officials are so immoral and so beyond the pale, but also because people feel like there's not really a voice for them within a system that's, largely controlled by Republicans.